Good morning, everyone. I was talking to some of you before Mass, and you were describing this time of year as a bit hectic. Doing your last-minute gift shopping and maybe getting the house ready for visitors to come, and it's a busy time, right? But as we inch closer to Christmas Day, this fourth Sunday of Advent asks us to slow down, to pause, and reflect before that joyous eruption that is often Christmas morning. Today's gospel asks us to put aside some of that holiday busyness and to reflect upon how God often works through human frailty. Just 10 days ago, on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, we heard in the Gospel of Luke that the angel Gabriel came to Mary and gave her an extremely troubling message. And the Gospel tells us she was confused. She didn't understand what all this was meaning and how it could happen. For I have not known a man. How can I be pregnant? But the Gospel tells us, Mary says, "May it be done to me according to your word." Despite not fully understanding what was happening, she gave an unhesitant yes. And in today's gospel, we hear from Matthew how the birth of Jesus Christ came about. And notice, there were no angels in the sky, no shepherds coming to a manger. What do we find? We find confusion, fear, uncertainty, and a tough dilemma for the man Joseph. And throughout the story, he doesn't say a word, but his actions speak volumes. Joseph discovers that Mary, to whom he is engaged, is pregnant. And for us who know the end of the story, it can seem maybe serene or holy, and how nice. But for Joseph, it's devastating. The woman he loves appears to have betrayed him. His dreams for the future are shattered. And at this moment in the story, we are far from a joyful Christmas morning, aren't we? Yet Matthew tells us that Joseph was a righteous man, and his righteousness wasn't evidenced by a harsh judgment upon Mary, but by mercy. He resolves to divorce her quietly and not expose her to harm or shame. And before any angel speaks, Joseph chooses compassion. And into this moment of uncertainty and heartbreak that God intervenes. He doesn't explain everything in detail to Joseph. He simply asks for trust. In a dream, the angel tells Joseph not to be afraid, for what has been conceived in Mary is through the Holy Spirit. And in that moment, Joseph is invited into God's plan. He's asked to take Mary into his home, to accept a child that is not biologically his, and to name the child Jesus. Now, in the biblical world, naming is a sign of responsibility and authority. And by naming Jesus, Joseph claims him as his own, protects him, and gives him a place in the line of David. The passage today tells us something profound about how God works. God enters into the world not through power or control, but through vulnerability, through a child, through a woman whose reputation is at risk, through a man who is asked to trust beyond what he could comprehend. And Joseph's obedience is quiet and immediate. Matthew tells us simply that when Joseph awoke, he did what the angel commanded. No speeches, no hesitation. just faithful action. Both Mary and Joseph exemplify what Paul called in our second reading today the obedience of faith. Neither of them fully understand what was happening or the ramifications of their assent, but they put their trust in God and said, yes. Well, it's a lot easier to see and understand events in hindsight, isn't it? It's a lot easier to see what God is doing when we look backwards, and it's also easy to see how God uses more than angels to speak to us. And as I reflect back on my own life, I've realized I've had a couple of Joseph moments as well, when it seemed like God was calling me to do something I really didn't fully understand. When I was 37 years old, which I realized that was half my life ago now, I was living in Indianapolis. I was a partner in a real estate development firm, and we took our company public, put it on the New York Stock Exchange. And in the couple years before that, I'd met some men who were involved in a worldwide ministry based in Washington, D.C., called the Golf Fellowship. You heard me right, the Golf Fellowship, a worldwide ministry. I mean, we were everywhere. I mean, at one point I spent 10 days as the guest of the Muslim president of Bangladesh. It was an amazing time. But after my company went public and I left to do other things, some men in that ministry said to Kim and I, hey, why don't you take like a gap year, move to Washington, D.C. for a year, work with us in the ministry, learn what you can, and then you can get on with your life. Well, this stink bug wants to hear my homily. Our first reaction when they invited us to come out for a year was to laugh. You know, kind of like when Abraham's wife Sarah laughed when told she was going to bear a child in her 80s. I mean, we had 3 young boys. We loved Indianapolis. And what were we going to do with the house? Sell it? Rent it and move back in a year? I don't know. But then, through a series of our own kind of angelic pronouncements, including a radio preacher, which is a story for another day, we eventually said yes. And that 1 year became 8. And that's during that time I received my master's in theology and later my doctorate. And it also paved the way for me becoming a deacon after I moved back to Louisville, which, for better or for worse, depending on your point of view, is why I'm standing here speaking to you today. And so as I think about it, I feel a certain kinship with Joseph, as I sure had no idea what I was getting into. And I could say the same thing about the ministry in Africa. You know, I've been going for 21 years now and just got back a week ago, and for much of my life I thought, why would anybody fly all the way over there? Because to do that, you got to fly over the poor in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia and the mountains of North Carolina. What about those folks? And then in 2004, an angel named Father John Judy said, hey, why don't you come with me on one of my trips? So I traveled to a distant land, not having a clue what I was getting into, and you know some of the great things that we've done together there now. What about you? As you look in hindsight, can you see where God has led you in situations you didn't fully understand? If you can, celebrate that. If you can, you've experienced Emmanuel. God is with us. And our gospel today invites us to look and listen for where God is calling us today, right? And to have that same level of trust in God as Mary and Joseph. Well, let me say something about the word trust. It is not naive optimism. It's not pretending that things are always easy and clear. Joseph's trust was born in the midst of uncertainty. He didn't have much information to go on, but he refused to act out of anger or fear. He paused. He reflected, and he created a space in which God could work in his life. And the really important part is he made himself available for what God asked. And when he was told that Mary's child was from the Holy Spirit, he was invited to step beyond what he could explain and into what he could only receive. Like Joseph, many of us know what it's like to have our plans interrupted, to have our life changed. We know what it's like to face situations we didn't choose. Illness, loss, broken relationships, unexpected responsibilities. Like Joseph, we're often asked to trust God without knowing what comes next. And so as we approach Christmas, Joseph stands before us as a model of discipleship. He invites us to ask, where is God asking me to place my trust? What fear is holding me back? What plans do I need to place in his hands? Joseph didn't know where his trust would lead, but he knew whom he trusted, and that made all the difference. And what he received was a life far different than what he imagined. May we learn from Joseph's example. May we trust God enough to act, even when the way forward is not clear. And may we discover, as Joseph did, that when we trust God, Emmanuel, God is with us, is already there. Merry Christmas.